Hello my dear friends and welcome to StudyIQ. I am Joy and today in this lecture we will discuss about RBI draft rules on bank CEO compensation. Coming to the current affair, the Reserve Bank of India has recently released draft rules on compensation for CEOs and full-time directors of banks. So with the draft rules released by the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, on the compensation and the packages given to CEOs, Chief Executive Officers, and the full-time directors of the banks, now there are certain restrictions on the private banks on the compensation or the allowances provided to CEOs and the directors of the banks. So we will discuss this in detail in this lecture. But before we move on, this is our channel StudyIQ and we are providing various pen drive courses for various competitive examinations like the SSC and bank courses, UPSC optionals, SSC JE courses, teaching examinations, railway examinations, defense examinations, RBI grade B, NABARD grade A, UGC NET, UPSC Civil Services Examination, CLAT exams for various state PSCs and also for various professional courses. You can visit our website www.studyiq.com for more details, or you can call to any of these numbers for more information. Let us first understand how is the violations by the bank executives dealt. The most important concern here is the asymmetry between India's state-owned banks, that is the public sector banks, and the private sector banks on compensation practices. So it means that there is a lack of equality or a payment differences between the payments given to public sector bank top management and the top management of the private sector banks. And this asymmetry continues even in case of violation of any rules or any offences committed by the management of public sector banks and the private sector banks. So in India, in case of state-owned banks, that is public sector banks, the executives have been punished by the government and the CBI books cases for offences or violations even though it is less grave offences. So in case of public sector banks, the government and the CBI will be punishing the executives of the public sector bank. But in case of private sector banks, there are no such proper guidelines or no such proper mechanism that will punish or that will take action against the violation of any rules or in case of any offences. A recent example is that of the ICICI Bank. And along with this, in India's top private sector banks, the chiefs, that is the top management, have the freedom to hire their own teams and the employees. But in case of public sector banks, the CEO or the top management have to appoint those persons chosen by the government. So we can say that in the financial institutions, when we compare the private sector banks and the public sector banks, there are many asymmetries or differences. The first one being indifferences in the salary or the packages given to the top management of public sector banks and the private sector banks. And the second difference is on dealing with any kind of offences or any kind of violations. Now the third one is regarding the appointment of the staff in the banks. So in all these parameters, the private sector banks are less transparent and less accountable to the general public or to the government. So if we take this fact into consideration, the accountability and the transparency of the private sector banks. So the private sector banks are owned by private individuals. So it is not the government's share or government owned banks, but they are dealing with financial instruments or the money that is owned by the general public. So it is the public money that is being transacted in both the private sector banks and in public sector banks. So dealing with public money makes the private sector banks also accountable to the general public, and therefore it is important to be more transparent on their transactions and on their governance functioning of the banks to the general public, because they are dealing with the money of the general public. So in this context, RBI has brought in recent developments or certain rules for the compensation of the CEOs and the full-time directors of the private sector banks. Now let us understand what are the recent developments or what are the rules that are released by the RBI in order to level the differences between private sector banks and the public sector banks. So we will see that the field, that is the banking industry in India, is being leveled. That is, the inequality between the private banks and the public sector banks are being narrowed down. For example, in the recent ICICI case, the CEO Chanda Kochar was involved in an allegation. So we will see that in terms of punishment for lapses or any violation or any offence committed, the private sector banks are also treated on par with the public sector banks. So the CBI had booked the case of Chanda Kochar on some major violations and fraud. So we will see that in case of lapses or any violations, the private sector banks and public sector banks are treated on par. And this levelling started with the tenure of former RBI Governor Urjit Patel. And under Governor Urjit Patel, the top private bank chiefs had to exit after major violations. One example is that of ICICI CEO Chanda Kochar. And there are also some other examples where the bankers had to leave the banks after the RBI found divergence in financial information or accounts from what their banks published. Now, what is the challenge that is remaining? The huge compensations paid to the CEOs or the full-time directors or the top management of this private sector banks. Now, this has to be leveled. And it is in this regard that RBI has come up with draft rules. Now let us understand what are the draft rules provided by the RBI in this regard. So RBI has quoted the example of Western countries. In the Western countries, the banking regulators and the central banks, the government, they decided to discourage excessive risk taking by the banks after the 2008 global financial crisis. So the banks or the regulators are not willing to take excessive risk by the banks. So following this, the Indian banks or the central bank, that is RBI, which is the monetary authority of the country, is also trying to tighten the executive compensation. So this is to ensure that the compensation paid to the chief executives or the top management of the private sector banks and the foreign banks are aligned with the risk undertaken by the banks. So in this regard, the first set of rules came into being in the year 2012, but no much changes happened, and later in 2009 the Financial Stability Board was set up, and the Financial Stability Board had come up with a set of principles and implementation standards on the compensation practices. So it had set rules or guidelines or principles on what should be the compensation of the private sector banks and the foreign banks. Now briefly about the FSB or the Financial Stability Board. So it is an international body and the purpose is to monitor and make recommendations about the global financial system, and it promotes international financial stability by coordinating various national financial authorities and international standard setting bodies. So it coordinates national authorities with that of international authorities. And importantly, the decisions of the FSB, Financial Stability Board, are not binding or not legally binding on the members, but instead it operates by moral suasion and peer pressure. It means that it will exert pressure on its members to follow the internationally agreed policies and the minimum standards in order to implement it at the national level. Now, India is also a member of the FSB. So, this is an important fact. This can be asked in your UPSC preliminary examination. So, you must understand that Financial Stability Board is an international body which monitors and also provides guidelines regarding implementation standards regarding compensation policies. India is a member and the decisions are not legally binding. So these are the important facts that you must understand from the examination point of view. Now coming to the key proposals in the draft. The first proposal, RBI proposed that at least 50% of the compensation packages of the private banks CEOs should be variable. So what is meant by variable package? Packages can be both variable or fixed. So fixed package means a person is paid regardless of meeting the goals of the company or the targets. Now variable packages means that the package is paid on various conditions. So certain condition needs to be met if the money or the salary has to be paid. So RBI recommended that at least 50% of the compensation packages of the private bank CEOs should be made variable packages. And secondly, the mix of cash, equity or any other form of compensation will be consistent with risk alignment. So this is the most important point. So the packages will be consistent with risk alignment. Now the draft rules also calls for penalty. So the rules allows for a penalty if the concerned bank underreports bad debt or any provision beyond the tolerance of the RBI. So in case of underreporting of bad debts or any malpractice or fraud in the accounting books, penalty will be applicable. And another rule set by the central bank is that there will be no concept of guaranteed bonus in the compensation plan. So there will be no guaranteed bonus to the CEO of the private bank, and this bonus will be consistent with the risk management and on the basis of performance-based principles. So performance and risk management will be two factors that will determine the bonus of the CEO. So there is no concept of guaranteed bonus anymore. So these are the key proposals made by RBI regarding the compensation of CEOs of the private sector banks. And for my lecture updates and the PDF of the lectures, you can visit my Facebook page or you can email me at joycey.studyiq for any queries regarding your preparations. Thank you.